The fever arrived in Millhaven, Arkansas, on a Wednesday in September of 1887, carried in the blood of a peddler who had come up the river from Little Rock, selling ribbons and thread, and, unknowingly, death. By Thursday, 3 children were burning with it. By Friday, the number had risen to 11. By the following Wednesday, 1 week after the peddler's cart had rolled into town, 47 souls lay in the grip of a sickness that Dr. Rudolph Hargrove could neither name with certainty nor treat with anything in his black leather bag. The fever climbed to 104, 105, 106. The afflicted shook with chills that no blanket could calm. Their tongues turned white, then brown. Their bellies swelled with a tenderness that made them cry out when touched. They stopped eating. They stopped drinking. Some of them stopped breathing. Dr. Hargrove, who had studied medicine at a proper college in St. Louis and who kept his diploma framed on the wall of his office where every patient could see it, tried everything he knew. He bled them. He blistered them. He dosed them with calomel and quinine and Dover's powder. He kept meticulous notes in a leather journal, recording symptoms and treatments and outcomes with the clinical precision of a man who believed that science, properly applied, could conquer any malady. But the fever did not read his notes, and it did not respect his diploma, and it kept on killing. 5 miles up Piney Creek, where the Ozark Hills folded into dark hollows thick with hardwood and the air smelled of sassafras and black walnut, Elspeth Calhoun was harvesting boneset. She was 51 years old, a lean woman with silver-streaked hair that she kept in a loose braid and hands that knew every plant in the Ozark woodland by touch. She had come to this hollow 30 years prior as a bride of 21, married to Amos Calhoun, a hill farmer who had loved her with quiet devotion until a falling oak took him in the winter of '79. Since then, she had lived alone with her buckskin mare, Thistle, her garden, and her knowledge. That knowledge ran deep. Elspeth's grandmother, Moira, had been a healer in the mountains of Western Virginia, a woman who carried the old Scots-Irish tradition of plant medicine that stretched back centuries before any college-trained physician had set foot in the Americas. Moira had taught her daughter, who had taught Elspeth, passing down the lore in the way such things had always been passed, by hand, by example, by the slow accumulation of seasons spent learning which root reduced a fever, which bark eased a cough, which leaf drawn as a poultice could pull the poison from a wound. Elspeth's garden was not a garden in any sense that the people of Millhaven would recognize. It sprawled across a 1/4 acre of cleared ground beside her cabin, divided into beds that followed no pattern a farmer would understand. There was no corn, no squash, no beans. Instead, there were rows of echinacea with their purple coneflower heads nodding in the breeze, beds of yarrow, golden seal, and black cohosh, stands of elderberry along the fence, wild bergamot and bee balm attracting clouds of pollinators, boneset and feverfew growing thick near the creek, plots of comfrey, plantain, and mullein. Hanging bundles of dried herbs festooned every rafter of her cabin, filling the air with a fragrance that was medicinal and ancient and deeply alive. She also kept a still room, a small outbuilding where she prepared tinctures, salves, poultices, and teas from her harvest. The shelves were lined with brown glass bottles, each one labeled in her careful hand. Elderberry syrup for winter illness, echinacea tincture for infections, willow bark extract for pain and fever, boneset tea for the ague, golden seal paste for wounds, 30 years of preparation, bottled and waiting. The people of Millhaven had opinions about all of this. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in the mountains, the hollows, or somewhere the old remedies still grow wild, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the crisis finally arrives. Millhaven was a proper town, or so it believed. It had a main street with a general store, a sawmill, a church with a bell tower, and, most importantly, a doctor. Dr. Rudolph Hargrove had arrived in 1881, fresh from his studies, and had immediately set about establishing himself as the sole authority on matters of health and healing. He was a tall, narrow man in his late 30s, with thin spectacles and a clipped manner of speaking that suggested he found most people tiresome. He carried his black bag like a preacher carries his Bible, as proof of a calling that elevated him above common folk. Hargrove had little patience for what he called root-grubbing superstition. The old hill women with their teas and poultices, their knowledge of plants and seasons, he dismissed them as relics of an ignorant age. Medicine was a science now, he declared. It belonged in the hands of trained professionals, not illiterate grandmothers mumbling over weeds. Elspeth Calhoun was his particular target. The Calhoun woman is dangerous, he told Reverend Jessamine Cook, the pastor of Millhaven's church, a stern woman of deep conviction and narrow sympathies. She dispenses concoctions of unknown composition to anyone who asks. She has no training, no credentials, no understanding of the principles of modern medicine. What she practices is not healing. It is witchcraft by another name. Reverend Cook needed little convincing. She had long regarded the reclusive herb woman with suspicion. The garden alone was cause for concern. All those strange plants, those mysterious preparations, that cabin festooned with drying bundles like some kind of pagan shrine. Add to that the fact that Elspeth rarely attended church, and the verdict was clear. The woman traffics in darkness, Reverend Cook declared from her pulpit one Sunday. The Lord provides healing through prayer and through the instruments of learned men. Those who seek remedies in the forest seek them from the devil's own pharmacy. The congregation murmured its agreement. Elspeth Calhoun was, thereafter, officially regarded as a woman to be avoided. The mockery took a harder edge than in other places because it carried the weight of religious condemnation. Children threw stones at Thistle when Elspeth rode to town for supplies. Women crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. The general store owner, a red-bearded man named Cullen Pratt, served her with visible reluctance, handling her coins as if they might carry contamination. Witch woman, the children called her. Root witch, weed crone. Elspeth bore it as she bore most things, with a silence that was not submission, but patience. She had her garden. She had her still room. She had Thistle, who was growing old but still made the journey to town and back without complaint. She had the knowledge that Moira had given her, and the certainty that knowledge, unlike opinion, did not change with the seasons. She also had patience, though she would never have called them that. Hill families mostly, scattered through the hollows around Millhaven, people too poor or too proud or too far away to visit Dr. Hargrove. They came to Elspeth's cabin quietly, often after dark, ashamed to be seen seeking the witch woman's help. She treated them without judgment and without charge, a colicky infant soothed with chamomile and fennel water, a logger's infected gash cleaned with golden seal and bound with comfrey, a grandmother's winter cough eased with elderberry and wild cherry bark. Small mercies, performed in secret, never spoken of in town. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. The peddler arrived on September 14th. He was a cheerful young man who had been working his way upriver for a month, selling dry goods to settlements along the Arkansas. He stayed 2 nights at the boarding house, conducted his business, and moved on. No one thought anything of it. Peddlers came and went. They were part of the rhythm of frontier life. What this particular peddler left behind was typhoid. The disease announced itself 3 days after his departure, when the Purcell children, the 3 of them, aged 4, 7, and 9, began to spike fevers that would not break. Dr. Hargrove examined them with professional confidence. "Autumn fever," he pronounced. "Common enough. Rest and fluids. They'll recover inside a week." They did not recover. By the end of that week, every member of the Purcell household was ill, and the sickness had begun to spread. Typhoid moved through Millhaven with a terrible efficiency. It traveled through water, through contact, through the invisible pathways that connected the lives of people who shared wells and handshakes and church pews. The symptoms were unmistakable to anyone who had seen the disease before: sustained high fever, headache, abdominal pain, the characteristic rose-colored spots on the chest and belly. But Dr. Hargrove had never seen typhoid. His training in St. Louis had been theoretical, his experience limited. He diagnosed influenza, then malaria, then bilious fever, grasping at terms that described symptoms without illuminating their cause. His treatments reflected his confusion. He bled patients who were already weakened by fever, draining the very vitality they needed to fight the disease. He administered calomel, a mercury compound that caused violent purging, further dehydrating bodies that were already desperate for fluid. He prescribed Dover's powder, a mixture of opium and ipecac, which masked symptoms while doing nothing for the underlying infection. The death toll began to climb. Little Patience Purcell, 4 years old, was the first to die. She passed on September 28th, 2 weeks after the peddler's visit. Her 7-year-old brother followed 3 days later. By mid-October, 11 people had perished, and 30 more lay ill in a town of fewer than 300. Panic set in. Families barricaded themselves in their homes. The church held continuous prayer meetings, Reverend Cook leading her diminishing congregation in desperate appeals to a heaven that seemed to have turned its face away. The schoolhouse closed. The sawmill went silent. Millhaven was dying, and the man with the diploma on his wall could do nothing to stop it. Elspeth knew what it was. She had recognized the symptoms from the first reports that filtered up to her hollow through the Hill families who still visited. Her grandmother had described typhoid in detail: the sustained fever, the abdominal distension, the rose spots, the terrible progression toward intestinal hemorrhage and death in the worst cases. Moira had treated it during an outbreak in the Virginia mountains in the 1830s, and she had passed that knowledge to her granddaughter along with everything else. Elspeth knew the disease, and she knew what would help. Not cure, she was honest enough to acknowledge the limits of her art, but help, reduce the fever, ease the suffering, support the body's own capacity to fight, keep the afflicted alive long enough for their own strength to prevail. She prepared for 3 days. She harvested her boneset, her elderberry, her echinacea. She brewed concentrated tinctures of willow bark for fever and yarrow for sweating. She prepared gallons of a clear broth infused with garlic, thyme, and sage. herbs that her grandmother had sworn possessed properties that fought infection from within. She made poultices of plantain and comfrey for the abdominal tenderness. She filled every bottle in her still room, loaded her wagon, and drove Thistle down the creek road toward the town that had called her a witch. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. She arrived at mid-morning on a gray October day, her wagon loaded with bottles and jars and bundles of dried herbs. The streets of Millhaven were nearly empty. Most people had retreated indoors, afraid to breathe the same air as their neighbors. The smell of sickness hung over the town like a pall, sour and unmistakable. She stopped first at Dr. Hargrove's office. The doctor was inside, slumped at his desk, his black bag open before him, his notes scattered like fallen leaves. His face was haggard, his spectacles smudged, his hands trembling with exhaustion and something worse, the knowledge that he was failing. 3 more patients had died overnight. He had nothing left to try. He looked up when Elspeth entered. His expression shifted from surprise to hostility in an instant. "Mrs. Calhoun, I believe I have made my position on your activities quite clear." "You have," Elspeth said calmly, "and I have made no effort to interfere with your practice, doctor. But your patients are dying, and I believe I can help some of them live." "With weeds and superstition?" "With bone-set tea for the fever, willow bark to bring the temperature down, elderberry to strengthen the body's defenses, clean water boiled with thyme and garlic for nourishment. And one thing more, doctor, that I suspect you have not tried. I would have them stop taking your calomel. The mercury is poisoning them faster than the disease." Hargrove's face went white, then red. "You dare? I dare because children are dying," Elspeth said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Your diploma has not saved them. Your calomel has not saved them. Your bleeding has not saved them. I am not asking you to believe in my methods. I am asking you to let me try." For a long moment, the two of them stared at each other across the cluttered desk. The college-trained physician and the hill woman with her bundles of roots and flowers. The silence stretched until it ached. It was broken by a knock at the door. Agnes Purcell, the mother who had already lost 2 children, stood on the threshold. Her face was a mask of grief and terror. Her remaining child, her eldest daughter, was burning with fever. "Doctor," she whispered, "Margaret is worse. Please, is there anything at all?" Hargrove looked at the woman. He looked at his empty bag, his useless notes, his framed diploma. He looked at Elspeth Calhoun. "Mrs. Calhoun," he said, each word costing him something he would never recover. "Will you see the girl?" It was not a question. It was a surrender. Elspeth went to the Purcell home. Margaret, 13 years old, lay in a bed soaked with sweat, her fever at 105, her pulse rapid and thready, her abdomen swollen and tender. She had not eaten in 4 days. She had not taken water in 2. Elspeth worked with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She brewed bone-set tea and spooned it between Margaret's cracked lips, drop by patient drop. She applied cool cloths soaked in willow bark infusion to the girl's forehead and wrists. She prepared a thin broth of boiled water, garlic, sage, and thyme, feeding it with the same slow patience. She placed a warm poultice of plantain on the girl's abdomen to ease the swelling, and she stopped the calomel. By evening, Margaret's fever had dropped 2 degrees. By the following morning, she was taking broth on her own. By the 3rd day, she was sitting up. Agnes Purcell wept. Word spread through Millhaven with the speed of desperate hope. The witch woman had come down from her hollow. She had treated the Purcell girl. The girl was alive. They came to Elspeth then, not with stones or insults or averted eyes, but with the raw, unadorned terror of people who had no other hope. Mothers carrying children, husbands supporting wives, the elderly led by the young. They came to the woman they had called a witch and begged her to save their families. Elspeth did not hesitate. She set up a treatment station in the church. Reverend Cook, who had been among the most vocal in condemning her, was too ill herself to object and began seeing patients. She worked 18 hours a day, moving from bedside to bedside, brewing her teas, applying her poultices, spooning broth into mouths that had forgotten how to swallow. She recruited helpers. She taught the women of Millhaven how to prepare the boneset tea, how to apply the willow bark compresses, how to make the healing broth. She showed them how to boil every drop of water before drinking it, a precaution that Dr. Hargrove had never thought to recommend, but that Elspeth's grandmother had insisted upon during every fever outbreak she had ever witnessed. "The sickness lives in bad water," Elspeth told them. "Boil it, always boil it. Kill whatever hides within." The dying slowed. Then it stopped. Over the following 3 weeks, Elspeth treated 89 patients. She lost 6, all of them elderly or already weakened beyond recovery when she reached them. The rest survived. 83 people who would have faced Dr. Hargrove's calomel and bleeding and Dover's powder instead received boneset and willow bark and garlic broth and clean water. 83 people who were alive in November because a woman they had called a witch had spent 30 years growing medicine in her garden. The reckoning came in December when the last patient had recovered and the town gathered in the church to give thanks. The pews were full for the first time since the outbreak. The faces were drawn and tired, but they were living faces, and that was miracle enough. Dr. Hargrove asked to speak first. He stood before the assembly in a wrinkled shirt, his spectacles in his hand, his black bag notably absent. He was not the same man who had arrived in Millhaven 6 years prior with his diploma and his certainty. That man had died somewhere during the long October nights, replaced by someone smaller and more honest. "I came to this town believing that I possessed the knowledge to heal," he said slowly. "I dismissed Mrs. Calhoun's methods as superstition. I called her practice witchcraft. I encouraged this community to shun her and to trust in my training alone." He paused. His voice, when he continued, was barely audible. "My training killed people. My calomel weakened patients who needed strength. My bleeding drained the vitality they needed to fight. I followed the procedures I had been taught, and those procedures were wrong." He looked at Elspeth, who sat in the pew she had always occupied when she did attend services, the last one near the door. "Mrs. Calhoun's remedies saved this town. Her knowledge, the knowledge I dismissed as ignorance, proved more effective than anything in my black bag. I was a proud man, and my pride cost lives. I will carry that burden for the rest of my days." Reverend Cook rose next. She was still weak from her own bout with the fever, a bout that Elspeth had treated with the same gentle competence she offered everyone, without reproach, without reminder of the sermons that had condemned her. "I spoke from this pulpit against Mrs. Calhoun," the Reverend said, her voice trembling. "I called her work the devil's pharmacy. I was wrong. If the Lord's healing comes through the plants he placed upon this earth, then the woman who tends those plants is doing the Lord's work, and I was too blind to see it." She turned to Elspeth. "Forgive me, please." Others rose. Cullen Pratt, who had handled her coins with disgust. Mothers who had crossed the street to avoid her. The parents of children who had thrown stones at Thistle. When the confessions were spent, Elspeth Calhoun stood. The church fell silent. She was not a woman given to speeches. Her life had been lived in action, not words, in the planting and harvesting and preparation, in the quiet midnight ministrations to the sick, in the patience required to tend a garden that most people could not understand. "My grandmother taught me that the earth provides," she said simply. "Every remedy I use during the fever grows within walking distance of this church. The boneset by the creek, the elderberry along the fences, the willow bark from the trees your children climb. It has always been here. You simply did not know how to see it." She looked around the room, at the doctor who had called her dangerous, the reverend who had called her sinful, the neighbors who had called her witch. "I hold no anger toward any of you. Fear makes people cruel, and ignorance makes them afraid. What matters now is that we learn, not just the names of plants and their uses, but the deeper lesson. That knowledge does not belong only to those with diplomas on their walls. Sometimes it lives in a garden. Sometimes it lives in the memory of an old woman who learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from hers." She paused. "I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. The garden is open. The still room is open. Come when you are ready." Thank you for watching this story about Elspeth Calhoun and the herb garden of Millhaven. When we dismiss what we do not understand, we risk losing the very knowledge that might save us. If this story reminded you that wisdom has many sources and healing has many hands, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever dismissed knowledge you carried because it did not come from a book? That winter, 14 women and 3 men began making regular visits to Elspeth's cabin on Piney Creek. She taught them what Moira had taught her, how to identify the healing plants, how to harvest them without destroying their source, how to prepare tinctures and teas and poultices, how to read the signs of illness and match them to the proper remedy. Dr. Hargrove was among the students. He came reluctantly at first, his pride still smarting, but genuine curiosity and genuine shame drove him forward. He brought his medical knowledge to the exchange, sharing what he understood of anatomy and disease, and discovered that Elspeth's empirical wisdom and his theoretical training were not enemies, but partners. Together, they developed an approach to treatment that combined the best of both traditions. Reverend Cook planted a medicinal garden behind the church. She tended it herself, learning the names and uses of each plant, preaching sermons that spoke of the Lord's provision growing in the very soil beneath their feet. The phrase "asking Elspeth" entered the vocabulary of the Ozark Hollows. It meant seeking knowledge from unexpected sources, trusting experience alongside education, respecting the wisdom that lived outside of institutions. It was spoken with warmth, with gratitude, with the particular reverence that people reserve for those who saved their lives. Elspeth Calhoun lived another 19 years, passing peacefully in the spring of 1906 at the age of 70. She was buried beside Amos in the hollow where they had built their life, beneath a stone that Dr. Hargrove, by then an old man himself, insisted upon purchasing with his own money. The inscription reads, "She tended the garden tended us." Thistle had preceded her by 3 years, buried near the fence where the elderberries grew thickest. The still room still stands. Local families maintain it as a teaching space, its shelves restocked each season with tinctures and salves prepared according to Elspeth's methods. The brown glass bottles bear the same careful labels, written in a hand that has been copied faithfully for over a century. Moira, who had started it all in the mountains of Virginia, would have recognized everyone